Hello everyone and welcome to Adam's Scary Stories. I collect unforgettable tales that will stay with you long after they're over, and I need your support to keep them coming. Ready for tonight's story? Kill the lights, put in your earbuds. It's time to begin our journey into the dark. My name is Kyle Hansen, and I've been working the graveyard shift at a Denny's restaurant outside of Salem, Oregon for just over 4 years now. Most people think that kind of work is mind-numbing, and honestly, there are nights when it absolutely is. But I learned long ago that the overnight hours in a rural Oregon restaurant near the highway attract a certain type of human experience. The kind that most people never see, and frankly, most people never want to see. It was March of 2023 when everything started to shift for me, not gradually either. It happened on a single night, a Tuesday that felt no different from any other Tuesday. I'd clocked in at 11 in the evening, changed into my uniform in the break room, and started prepping the station. Our Denny's sits about 7 miles outside of Salem's main commercial district, positioned between a shuttered gas station and what used to be a roadside motel. The motel had been condemned years ago, boarded up, chain-locked gates, the kind of place that inspired local teenagers to dare each other to climb the fence and peek through the windows. I was 34 years old at that point, divorced, living in a small apartment with a landlord who didn't believe in maintaining anything. I had 2 teenage daughters who I saw every other weekend, and I was trying my best not to be the kind of guy who disappeared from his kids' lives. The graveyard shift paid marginally better, and it meant I could attend their school events during the day. It wasn't glamorous, but it was something. The restaurant was unusually quiet that night. By 1 in the morning, we'd only had 3 customers. One was a trucker who ordered coffee and an omelet and barely spoke. The second was an older gentleman in a windbreaker who sat alone in a booth reading a newspaper. The third was something else entirely. A woman who came in around midnight, ordered water, and sat in the corner booth facing the door. She never looked at anything but the wall behind the register. I remember her clearly because of something Evelyn, one of our waitresses, said about her. "That woman's waiting for someone," Evelyn told me as she brought back the empty water glass. "She keeps checking her phone but never calls or texts, just looks at it and puts it down. And her hands are shaking." I didn't pay much attention at the time. We see a lot of people in transition at the Denny's, particularly during the late hours. People between lives, between cities, between whatever was and whatever was coming next. It's not unusual to see distress or anxiety in their faces. Around 2:30 in the morning, when I was reviewing inventory in the kitchen, I heard the bell chime that signals a new customer entering. I wasn't due on the floor. Evelyn was covering the dining area, so I continued what I was doing. But then I heard her voice change. She went from normal to something higher, more tense. "I don't think he wants to talk to anyone," she was saying. I stepped out of the kitchen. The man who had entered was striking, not because of his appearance, but because of the way he seemed to occupy space. He was lean, maybe mid-50s, wearing dark clothes despite it being the middle of the night. But what caught my attention was his face. It looked entirely wrong. Not scarred or disfigured in any visible way, but proportionally strange, like it had been assembled from pieces that weren't quite meant to fit together. His eyes were dark, and they moved around the room in a scanning pattern, methodical. He walked directly to the corner booth where the woman had been sitting, but she was gone. I hadn't seen her leave. "We're not serving anyone at this time," Evelyn said, which was a lie. She had 3 hours left on her shift, but she seemed to understand in some instinctive way that this man should not be served. He turned to her, and I watched as her face went pale. Not pale like she was afraid, pale like all the blood had drained from her head at once. Her hand moved to her throat. "Where did she go?" he asked. His voice was quiet and inflectionless, like a recording of speech rather than actual communication. "The woman who was here." I don't know," Evelyn stammered. "I didn't see her leave." He looked back at the booth. Then he looked at me. And in that moment, something inside my chest began to vibrate at a frequency that felt wrong. Like my organs were suddenly trying to occupy the same space at the same time. I knew without knowing why that whatever this man was, it wasn't interested in casual conversation about a missing woman. "Your restroom," he said, not asking. I pointed toward the back of the restaurant, toward the hallway where the bathrooms were located. He moved in that direction, but his movement was strange. Not quite a walk, more like a shifting of position from one location to another. Evelyn was gripping the counter so hard that her knuckles had turned white. "Call the police," I told her, my voice barely above a whisper. "For what?" she asked. "What did he do?" That was the problem. He hadn't done anything. He just entered a restaurant at 2:30 in the morning looking for a woman who had vanished from a locked building with only one entrance and exit, and his face was the wrong shape. I walked to the hallway. The bathroom doors were at the end, one for men, one for women. Both were standing open, both were empty. I stood there for what felt like several minutes, though my sense of time had become unreliable. I didn't hear any sounds. I didn't hear the man at all. When I turned to go back to the dining area, he was standing at the other end of the hallway, about 20 feet from me. I didn't know how he'd gotten there. I hadn't heard him move. "She comes here to wait," he said, "but she never arrives. She never arrives anywhere anymore. She's learning what it means to be in transition. I'm going to ask you to leave," I managed to say, though my voice sounded like it was coming from very far away. He didn't move. "You felt it when I looked at you. The wrongness. That's because you've seen something you shouldn't have, something that sits at the edge of what your mind allows itself to understand. It changes you. Not immediately, but over time, the world will stop feeling like it fits anymore. Then, and I still don't have a good explanation for this, he was moving backward, away from me, but not moving his feet, just sliding backward through the air like a video being rewound. He reached the door of the restaurant and continued backward out into the parking lot. Through the windows, I watched him slide across the asphalt toward the old motel. Then he was gone. Evelyn called 911. The police arrived about 30 minutes later. I explained what had happened, and the officer, a young man named Officer Chen, listened with the kind of professional patience that suggested he didn't believe a word of it. He checked the bathrooms, the parking lot, reviewed the security footage. But the security footage showed something I hadn't expected. There was no gap in the footage, but the man simply didn't appear in it. We had footage of Evelyn and me reacting to him, looking at empty space, pointing, gesturing to a complete absence. And earlier, the footage showed the woman in the corner booth, but it showed her getting up and walking out the front door at 2:17 a.m., something I hadn't seen, something Evelyn hadn't seen. "No signs of forced entry," Officer Chen said, filing his report. "No theft. What he appears to be is a transient, possibly mentally ill. You both might have experienced a panic episode triggered by his unusual presentation." I nodded along, but I knew that wasn't what had happened. Something had occurred in that restaurant that existed outside the parameters of normal reality, and whatever it was, it had left a mark on me. Not a visible one, but I felt it like a hairline fracture deep inside my chest. Evelyn quit 3 days later. She texted me from a number I didn't recognize. "I keep seeing her, the woman from the booth. She's in my apartment now. She's in my walls. She's learning me. Don't go back there. That place is in the wrong place. The coordinates are wrong." I continued working at the Denny's for another 8 months. In that time, I never saw the man or the woman again. But I saw other things. People who didn't move quite right, conversations that seemed to happen without anyone speaking, and once an entire family of customers who, when I went to bring them their order, were simply gone, not run out of the restaurant, just absently missing, like they had never been there at all, though their table still held hot plates of food. I no longer work at the Denny's. I'm a day manager at a grocery store now in Portland, about 60 miles away. The distance helped at first, but the fracture inside me has never healed. Sometimes late at night, I see the woman from the corner booth standing at the edge of my vision. She's never looking directly at me, but I know she's aware of me. I know she's learning me the way that man said she would. My ex-wife noticed a change in me. She mentioned it when she dropped the girls off last month. "You seem like you're not entirely here sometimes," she said. "Like you're looking at things that aren't there." I didn't tell her why. How do you explain to someone that a restaurant near Salem exists in a location that is slightly wrong, and that wrongness spreads like a stain to anyone who spends time inside it? The Denny's is still there. I drive past it sometimes on my way to other places. I never stop, but I watch the parking lot and I see other cars pulling in during the late hours. I see people going in, and I wonder which of them will see something they shouldn't see, and whether they'll feel that same vibrating wrongness inside their chest. I wonder if they'll spend the next year or two feeling like the world no longer fits correctly around them. And I wonder if that's what the woman is doing. Learning people, marking them, teaching them that reality is more fragile than they ever believed. The thing that terrifies me most is that I've started seeing her look directly at me. And when she does, I feel myself slipping. I feel myself becoming the kind of person who comes to the restaurant to wait, the kind of person who never arrives anywhere anymore, the kind of person whose coordinates are wrong. I no longer know where I actually am. My name is Daniel Reeves, and I've been a Forest Service officer in the Cascade Mountains near Bend, Oregon for 14 years. That's 14 years of managing timber operations, conducting safety inspections, tracking wildlife populations, and dealing with the occasional lost hiker or irresponsible camper. I've always considered myself a rational man, someone who understands the physical world according to the laws of nature and logic. That understanding was severely tested in August of 2022. I was conducting a routine inspection of a logging operation about 12 miles northeast of Bend, on a road designated FR 4722. The operation was being run by a mid-sized timber company, and everything had been going smoothly according to the paperwork. The crew had been pulling selective timber from that region for about 3 weeks without incident. I drove out there on a Wednesday morning, my truck loaded with inspection equipment, my GPS unit charged and ready. The logging road itself isn't particularly scenic. It's essentially a cleared path through old-growth forest, rutted and unpaved, marked every mile or so with reflective posts. I'd driven it dozens of times. The forest around it is dense and quiet, the kind of place where sound seems to get absorbed by the trees themselves. On that particular morning, the weather was overcast, the kind of mild gray that characterizes late summer in Central Oregon. I arrived at the work site around 8 in the morning. The crew was already operational. I could hear the saw equipment cutting wood about a quarter mile into the timber stand. I parked my truck and started walking toward the sound, making sure to wear my orange safety vest and radio to alert them to my presence. Protocol demands that I always announce myself to active logging crews. As I walked, I became aware of something unusual. The forest felt different than it normally did. The usual ambient sounds, birds, the rustle of wind through needles, the occasional crack of a branch were absent. It was a silence that felt almost physical, like the air itself had become thick and heavy. I continued walking, but after about 5 minutes I realized something else. I couldn't hear the saw equipment anymore. I'd been walking toward the sound, but instead of getting closer, the sound had vanished entirely. I checked my radio to confirm I was on the right channel. The crew should have been audible. There should have been voices, equipment noise, the beeping of trucks backing up. But there was nothing. I pulled out my GPS unit. It showed my location as 43.72 degree N, a 121.31 degree W, which was correct. But when I looked around, I couldn't identify any landmarks that matched my previous visits to this site. The trees seemed different, older in a way I couldn't quite articulate, as if the forest around me had aged a decade in the time it took me to walk a quarter mile. I decided to turn back toward my truck. But as I did, I became uncertain about which direction I'd come from. The forest looked the same in all directions. I pulled out my radio again. "Crew lead, this is Daniel Reeves, Forest Service. Can you respond?" Static. No response. I tried again, this time calling the main office in Bend. Still nothing but static and a faint sound underneath it. A sound like breathing, or wind through a very narrow space. That's when I saw the clearing. It appeared in front of me even though I hadn't walked toward any clearing. The trees just seemed to open up, and there was a circular area about 50 feet in diameter where nothing was growing. At the center of the clearing was a structure. I say structure rather than building because I'm not entirely sure what it was. It was constructed from wood, logs arranged in a pattern I didn't recognize, and it appeared to be very old. Not decades old, centuries old, maybe longer. The wood had weathered to a gray-black color, and moss and lichen covered most of the surface. I approached it carefully. My rational mind was already working through explanations. Perhaps this was an old homestead from the early 1900s, something that predated the Forest Service records. Perhaps I was suffering from some kind of disorientation, heat stroke, something medical. But the closer I got to the structure, the more certain I became that neither of those explanations was correct. The entrance to the structure was open, just a dark opening in the wooden frame. But I could see inside, and what I saw made my stomach drop. There were shapes inside, humanoid shapes, but not quite human. They were standing against the interior walls, dozens of them arranged in neat rows. They weren't moving. I ran. I turned away from the structure and ran back through the forest, trusting my instincts rather than my GPS. I ran for what felt like an hour, my legs pumping, my breath coming in gasps. I crashed through undergrowth, slipped on rocks, tore my uniform on branches. I ran until I couldn't run anymore, and then I walked, and then I ran again. When I finally saw my truck, I felt a wave of relief so intense that it made my knees weak. I stumbled toward it, pulled open the driver's side door, and collapsed inside. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely grip the steering wheel. I got the engine started and drove backward down the logging road as fast as I dared, spraying gravel and churning mud. I called the main office once I was back on the paved highway. I told my supervisor that there was a medical emergency at the work site, that I needed backup immediately. I didn't tell him what I'd seen. I knew how that would sound. 2 Forest Service officers and 2 county sheriffs arrived at the logging road site within the hour. I drove them back out there, but the work site was normal. The logging crew was there, actively working, the equipment running smoothly. The crew lead, a man named Tom Sullivan, had no idea what I was talking about when I asked him why he hadn't answered my radio calls. He said he'd tried reaching me at 8:15, but I hadn't responded. He said they'd seen my truck arrive and drive away again. One of the sheriffs, a woman named Deputy Garrett, took me aside. "Did you consume anything unusual today? Any medications, supplements?" she asked carefully. "No, nothing. I know what I saw. The thing is, you didn't. You were gone for maybe 20 minutes. You drove in, parked, got out of your truck, and then got back in and drove away. There's no clearing out there, no structure. We searched the area you described, nothing but forest. I insisted we search further, but the search turned up nothing. No structure, no clearing, no rows of humanoid shapes. The forest in that direction looked exactly like forest everywhere else, and the GPS track on my device showed that I'd walked approximately 150 feet from my truck before turning around and walking back. According to the electronic record, I'd never gone more than 2 minutes walk from the vehicle. The sheriffs decided it was a case of forest disorientation, a phenomenon where people become confused in wooded areas and experience hallucinations or false memories. It happens sometimes, but I knew what I'd seen. I knew the walk had taken much longer than 2 minutes. I knew the forest had changed around me. I took a week's leave from the Forest Service. My supervisor suggested counseling. I went to see a therapist in Bend, a woman named Dr. Patricia Kim. I told her about the experience, leaving out the most disturbing details. I told her about the disorientation, the confusion about time, the sense that the forest had altered around me. She suggested it was a panic attack brought on by isolation and work stress. She prescribed me an anti-anxiety medication. I didn't fill the prescription. 3 days after I returned to work, I received a call from the Forest Service. The logging operation on FR 4722 had been shut down, not by my recommendation, but by order of the regional office. There had been an incident. A worker had suffered what was described as a severe mental breakdown. He'd walked away from the worksite mid-shift and disappeared into the forest. Search and rescue had found him 12 hours later, sitting alone in the middle of a clearing that wasn't on any map. He was repeating the same phrase over and over. They're still standing in rows, still standing in the dark. He'd been transported to a psychiatric facility in Portland. The logging company had voluntarily halted operations on that particular parcel. I asked to see the report on the incident. According to the documentation, the worker's name was Kevin Pritchard, and he'd been employed with the logging crew for 6 months. His employment history before that showed gaps, multiple jobs lasting only weeks or months, references that were hard to track down. The intake psychiatrist at the Portland facility noted that Pritchard seemed to believe he was no longer fully present in the world. In his more lucid moments, he kept asking whether they had marked him, whether he was going to end up like the others. I drove back out to FR 4722 on my own about 6 weeks after the incident. I needed to know if what I'd experienced was real. I parked at the exact same spot and walked in the direction of where I'd seen the clearing. The forest was completely normal, no time distortion, no change in the trees, no clearing. Just forest. I walked for an hour and saw nothing unusual, but as I was leaving, I noticed something odd about my GPS unit. It showed that I'd walked in a straight line through the forest for approximately 5 miles, yet I'd only felt like I'd gone about a mile. The distance calculations and the timestamp were also inconsistent. My unit showed that the walk had taken 30 minutes, but my watch said I'd been hiking for less than 10 minutes. And there was a note in the GPS memory that I didn't remember making. The standing ones stay, the standing ones wait, the standing ones remember. I requested a transfer out of the Bend office. My supervisor didn't ask why, though I could see the concern in his face. I'm now stationed in Eugene, about an hour away from Bend, working primarily with environmental compliance rather than forest operations. I no longer work in the field actively. Sometimes I think about Kevin Pritchard and about what he saw in that clearing that made him believe he wasn't fully present anymore. I think about the rows of standing shapes, about whatever structure had been constructed in that remote section of forest. I think about the GPS note, the one I definitely didn't write, and what it means that something is standing and waiting and remembering. and I try very hard not to think about the fact that my dreams have changed in the past 3 years. Every night I'm standing in a clearing surrounded by trees, and I'm not moving. None of us are moving. We're just standing in rows in the dark, remembering things that haven't happened yet. My name is Ashley Knight, and I'm a state police officer with the Washington State Patrol. I've been on the force for 18 years, and in that time I've responded to hundreds of accidents, arrests, and incidents up and down Interstate 90 between Seattle and Spokane. I consider myself someone who understands human behavior in its worst forms. I've seen what people do to each other, what desperation drives them to. But in November of 2022, I encountered something I still can't explain, and it was reported to my superiors as a statistical impossibility. It started on a Tuesday evening around 5 o'clock. I was working the stretch of I-90 that runs through the Snoqualmie Pass area about 40 miles east of Seattle. The weather was deteriorating, clouds rolling in fast, temperature dropping. There was about an hour of daylight left, and I was thinking about wrapping up my shift and heading back to the Snoqualmie office when I spotted her. She was standing on the shoulder of the eastbound lane near milepost 52, about a mile east of the pass. Just standing there, no vehicle visible in either direction, wearing what looked like light clothes, definitely inappropriate for the weather conditions. I could see her shivering from about 200 feet away. Protocol says to approach carefully. I pulled onto the shoulder ahead of her and radioed dispatch that I was conducting a welfare check on a pedestrian. The dispatcher logged it at 5:17 p.m. I turned on my emergency lights to make the truck visible and stepped out. The woman was maybe in her early 30s with dark hair that was tied back. She was wearing a thin jacket and jeans, and her lips were already starting to take on a bluish tint from the cold. Her eyes were wide, and she looked at me with an expression of profound relief. "Thank God," she said as I approached. "Thank God you're here. I've been trying to get a ride for hours." "Where are you headed?" I asked, using the calm voice that training teaches you to use with people in distress. "Spokane," she said. "I'm trying to get to Spokane. I was hitchhiking, and my last ride dropped me off here about 6 hours ago. I've been trying to flag down another car ever since, but everyone just passes by. I was getting worried about hypothermia." This made sense. Hitchhiking on I-90 in November without appropriate gear was foolish, but it happened. People got stranded. I asked for her identification, and she provided it. A Washington State ID showing the name. Laura Maxwell, age 31, address in Seattle. The ID looked legitimate. "I can't transport you," I explained, "but I can call you a ride or contact the Highway Patrol's Community Assistance Program. Or you could wait here and I can check if any of the commercial truck drivers passing by might be willing to help." "No, please, I can't wait," she said, and for the first time, I heard something wrong in her voice. Not panic exactly, but an urgency that didn't quite match the situation. "I need to get to Spokane tonight. It's very important." I made a judgment call. The weather was deteriorating, and leaving someone on the side of the highway in these conditions wasn't safe. I decided to drive her to the Snoqualmie rest area about 2 miles away, where she could wait in a warm environment while I called for an official transport or contacted someone to pick her up. "Get in," I said. "I'll take you to the rest area." She got in the passenger side of my patrol car. As I was driving, I made small talk, the kind of conversation you make with people in distress to keep them calm. Where was she from? Why was she trying to get to Spokane? Did she have family or friends who could pick her up? She answered the questions, but her answers seemed disconnected. She said she was from Seattle but grew up in Spokane. She said she was going to visit her sister. But when I asked for her sister's phone number, she couldn't remember it. She kept repeating that she had to get to Spokane, that it was very important, but she couldn't articulate why. I pulled into the Snoqualmie rest area and parked. The time was 5:34 p.m., which meant the drive that should have taken about 8 minutes had somehow occurred in just 17 minutes total from the time I'd picked her up. But more than that, I noticed something on my dashboard camera. The video timestamp showed that I'd picked her up at 5:17, driven to the rest area, and arrived at 5:34. 17 minutes. But looking at the route, I'd driven faster than was reasonable or safe on the deteriorating road, and the video showed me moving at normal speed. The math didn't work. "Let me see if I can find your sister's information," I said, more to myself than to her. I pulled up my dispatcher contact and started working through the process of trying to locate someone named Maxwell in Spokane, with a connection to someone named Laura. When I turned to look at her a moment later, she was looking out the window with an expression of profound sadness. "I don't know if she's still alive," Laura said quietly. "I don't know if any of them are. I've been trying to reach this date for a very long time." "Reach what date?" I asked. "November 19th, she said. "This date. I've been on this highway so many times trying to get to Spokane before November 19th ends. But it never works. I always get picked up somewhere between milepost 50 and 55, and I always get driven to this rest area, and I always arrive at 5:34 p.m. I've been doing this for a very long time." I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. "What year is it?" I asked. "It's 2022, she said, "but it's also 1998, it's also 2008, it's always November 19th, and I'm always trying to reach Spokane and I never make it." I died on November 19th, 1998. I was hitchhiking on this highway and a man picked me up. He drove me past Snoqualmie Pass and he drove me off the road near milepost 72. He killed me there. I've been trying to get away from that moment ever since, but I can't. I keep getting pulled back to this road, this date, this time, and I keep arriving at this rest area at 5:34 p.m., and something always prevents me from continuing to Spokane. My hand was shaking as I reached for my radio. I called dispatch and asked them to look up any missing persons reports from 1998 in the Snoqualmie Pass area. The dispatcher came back within 2 minutes. Missing person, Laura Maxwell, age 21. Last seen November 19, 1998, hitchhiking on I-90. Her remains had never been found. The case was still technically open. "We need to document this," I managed to say. "We need to get you to a hospital, get you help." When I turned to look at Laura again, she was gone. Not gone from the car, gone in a way that I can't adequately describe. The passenger seat was empty, but I hadn't heard the door open or close. I looked around the rest area, checking the bathrooms, the parking lot. No sign of her. I contacted dispatch again and reported the situation. Within 30 minutes, I was being interviewed by my supervisor and a detective from the King County Sheriff's Office, a woman named Detective Kate Miller. I told them everything that had happened, and I showed them the ID that Laura had given me. They ran it through the system. The ID was legitimate, and it matched the missing person report from 1998. But there was a problem. According to the state database, Laura Maxwell had been declared legally dead in 2005, and the ID I was holding had been deactivated the same year. "Is it possible," Detective Miller asked carefully, "that someone had created a replica of the ID to trick you? Or that you experienced a panic episode?" I understood why she was asking, but I also knew that wasn't what had happened. "Run the surveillance footage from the rest area," I said. "There will be footage of me picking her up, bringing her here, and then her disappearing." They did run the footage, and according to the cameras, I'd arrived at the rest area alone. There was video of me pulling into the parking lot, getting out of my vehicle and looking around. There was video of me talking on my radio, looking distressed, but there was no video of me bringing anyone with me. I was alone in the car the entire time. My superiors decided that I needed to take a psychological evaluation. I was put on temporary leave. The evaluation found no signs of psychosis or hallucination, but the evaluator noted that I seemed to be experiencing what might be described as a dissociative episode, or the early signs of post-traumatic stress. I never returned to the Snoqualmie Pass section of I-90. I requested a transfer to a different district, and it was granted. I now patrol sections of the highway further west, closer to Seattle. But I learned something during my investigation into the Laura Maxwell case. The man who killed Laura Maxwell in 1998 was apprehended in 2001 on the basis of evidence I helped uncover after my encounter with her. His name was Gregory Strand, and he'd killed other women in that region between 1995 and 2000. He's currently serving 3 consecutive life sentences in Washington State Prison. When I visited him, something I probably shouldn't have done without telling my supervisor, he told me something that changed my understanding of what happened at the rest area. "There's something on that road," he said from behind the prison interview glass. "Between milepost 50 and 55, something that gets people. I picked up a woman hitchhiker there once, and then she was gone from my car. I thought I'd imagined it. But I think she was trying to get away from me. I think she was trying to prevent what was going to happen. I think she kept trying over and over at the same place and time. I still drive I-90 occasionally, though I try to avoid that particular section. And every year on November 19th, I listen to the dispatch logs. Every year there's a report of a stranded woman on the shoulder near milepost 52. Every year when officers arrive, she's gone. And every year an officer reports arriving at a destination in an impossibly short amount of time. I don't know if Laura Maxwell is still trying to reach Spokane. I don't know if she's still trying to get away. But I know that something on that stretch of highway exists outside normal time and space, and it's been catching people for longer than anyone's been documenting it. And I know that if you're traveling I-90 between Snoqualmie Pass and Spokane on November 19th, and you see a woman hitchhiking, you should not pick her up. Because if you do, you might arrive at your destination 17 minutes earlier than you should, and you might lose 6 hours of your life in the time it takes to travel 8 miles. And you might understand for just a moment what it feels like to be unstuck in time. My name is James Ashford, and I'm an independent filmmaker. I've been making documentary work for about 9 years, focusing on the history of small communities and industrial regions in the Pacific Northwest. I'm particularly interested in the abandoned mill towns, the places where logging and timber processing created temporary prosperity and then abruptly ended, leaving ghost towns in their wake. In the spring of 2023, I received a commission to create a documentary about the dead mill towns of Oregon and Washington. The project was sponsored by a regional historical society, and I was given a modest budget to travel, film, and conduct interviews. I spent about 3 weeks planning the project, identifying 5 different towns that would serve as the primary focus: Mayfield, Washington; Gilchrist, Oregon; Tiller, Oregon; Days Creek, Oregon; and a smaller community called Burnt Ridge that wasn't officially a town but had been a significant lumber camp in the 1970s. I started my filming in April of 2023, visiting each location and filming the remaining structures: the old mill buildings, the abandoned houses, the overgrown residential areas. The process was meditative and a bit melancholy. These places had been living, breathing communities once. People had been born there, raised families, experienced their entire lives in these small towns. Now they were empty, reclaimed by nature. Burnt Ridge was my last stop, positioned in the coastal range between Oregon and Washington, about 30 miles from the nearest town of any size. It had been a significant lumber camp from 1968 to 1982, employing about 200 people at its peak. The camp had been abruptly shut down when the timber rights were transferred to a different company. The houses, the administrative buildings, and the mill infrastructure had been left largely intact as the population evacuated. When I arrived at Burnt Ridge in late April, I was struck by how completely abandoned it was. There was no sign of anyone having been there in decades. The houses had broken windows, doors standing open, nature pushing through every available crack. The mill building was a skeleton of metal beams, the corrugated metal walls rusted and falling away. I spent a full day filming, capturing the decay and emptiness from every angle. It was around 5 in the afternoon when I noticed that there were fresh tracks in the dust of the mill building. Footprints, multiple people by the look of it. The tracks seemed to wind through the building, going deeper toward the interior processing areas. I realized I wasn't actually sure how extensive the mill's interior was, and I decided to follow the tracks to get a better sense of the space. I turned on my camera light and stepped into the mill building. The interior was dim, lit only by the failing afternoon light that came through gaps in the walls. The air smelled like rust and old wood and something else, something organic and slightly sweet. The footprints led toward the back of the building, toward a section where the roof had partially collapsed. As I walked deeper into the mill, I began to notice something odd about the space. The mill should have been single-story. I'd seen the external dimensions, but as I walked, the interior seemed to be expanding, becoming deeper than it should be. The walls seemed to recede into distance that didn't match the external architecture. I kept filming. My camera light was providing the only real illumination, and it was creating strange shadows. At one point, I could have sworn I saw a figure standing in the darkness ahead of me, but when I pointed my light directly at the spot, there was nothing there. The footprints led to a doorway that I didn't remember seeing from outside. I stepped through it and found myself in what appeared to be a large industrial space, much larger than should have been possible given the external dimensions of the mill. The space stretched away into darkness. My camera light couldn't reach the far end, and then I heard it. The sound of the mill operating, the sound of saws cutting wood, of machinery running, of people working. It was impossible. The mill had been shut down for 40 years, but I could hear it clearly. I could hear voices calling to each other, the beeping of trucks backing up, the rumble of conveyor systems. I could smell sawdust and wood fresh from cutting. I turned my camera toward the sound, and through the viewfinder I could see the mill as it must have been in the 1970s. It was fully operational. The machinery was running. The space was lit by industrial lights and people were moving through the space. But when I lowered the camera and looked with my naked eye, I saw only the abandoned, dark, empty mill. I lowered the camera and the sound stopped. The space was silent again. But when I raised the camera, the sounds returned. The mill came back to life in the viewfinder. I realized that my camera was showing me something that didn't exist in the normal spectrum, something that my eye couldn't see but that the camera sensor could detect. I stood there for a very long time, switching between lowering and raising the camera. Every time I raised it, the mill came back to life. Every time I lowered it, the mill was dead again, and I realized that the footprints I'd been following belonged to people who were no longer present. They belonged to workers from 1975 or 1978 or some other year when the mill was operational. The footprints were a kind of temporal echo, preserved in the dust of a dead space. I backed out of the mill building slowly, keeping my camera up, watching as the operational mill faded the further I got from the interior. By the time I reached the entrance, the camera was showing me only the abandoned structure again. I got in my car and drove away from Burnt Ridge. I didn't return to film any additional footage. I drove to the nearest town, a place called Drain, Oregon, and I spent the night in a motel trying to process what I'd experienced. The next morning, I reviewed my footage. The footage from inside the mill showed exactly what I'd seen. The abandoned, empty space with no sign of operational machinery or workers. The camera hadn't captured the image of the functioning mill at all. But my audio recording had captured the sounds. There were hours of mill sounds on the audio track. The machinery, the voices, everything I'd heard. But the audio didn't match any known recording of mill sounds. The voices were distorted in a way I couldn't explain, and the machinery sounds seemed to be coming from multiple distances at once, like they were being broadcast from several different locations simultaneously. I tried to use the footage and audio to create the documentary, but I couldn't make it work. The documentary sponsors weren't interested in hearing about temporal anomalies or camera phenomena they couldn't verify. They wanted a straightforward historical piece, and I couldn't give them that. I delivered a simple documentary featuring the other 4 towns, but I left out all footage from Burnt Ridge. I've never done additional filming there, and I've never attempted to verify what I experienced. But 3 months after my visit to Burnt Ridge, I received a call from the Historical Society that sponsored the project. One of the other documentarians who had been researching local history had contacted them with a strange finding. In the archives of the mill company that had operated Burnt Ridge, there was a report from 1982 stating that 3 workers had disappeared from the mill on a date in April. The report was vague. It listed the men's names and said they'd gone into the mill to conduct a final salvage operation and never emerged. The company had not filed a missing persons report. The men were never found, and the disappearance was never investigated. The date listed in the report was April 19th. I had visited Burnt Ridge on April 26th. The disappearance had occurred 7 days before I arrived, but it had also occurred 41 years in the past. The footprints I'd seen in the dust had been fresh, as if they'd been made within days of my arrival. But the operation I'd witnessed on my camera, the fully functioning mill with workers present, had been the mill as it was in 1982 during the final salvage operation on the day those 3 men disappeared. I've never verified whether my camera captured genuine temporal echo or whether I experienced something else entirely. But I know that something at Burnt Ridge exists outside normal time. I know that the footprints I saw belong to people who have been missing for 41 years. And I know that my camera showed me the moment of their disappearance. I no longer work in documentary filmmaking. I work in advertising now, creating commercial content, and I'm careful about what I point my camera at. I'm careful about what I might accidentally capture, because I understand now that there are places where time doesn't work the way we assume it does. And there are people who have been missing for 41 years, who are still walking through those places, still trying to find their way out. My name is David Howell, and I'm a detective with the King County Sheriff's Office in Washington. I've been on the force for 22 years, and I've investigated everything from home invasions to serial crimes to financial fraud. I consider myself someone who understands the criminal mind and the patterns of criminal behavior. But in the summer of 2021, I was assigned to a case that defied every logical pattern I'd ever encountered. On July 15th, 2021, a guest house in the town of Corvina, Washington, reported a missing guest to local police. The guest, a man named Thomas Kirkwood, had rented the property for a weekend. He'd checked in on Friday evening, and by Monday morning he hadn't checked out, had stopped responding to texts from the property manager, and had apparently vanished from a locked room with no means of exit. When I arrived at the scene to begin my investigation, the property manager, a woman named Susan Matthews, was visibly distressed. She walked me through the timeline. Kirkwood had arrived Friday evening, paid in cash for 2 nights, and seemed like a perfectly normal guest. He hadn't asked for anything unusual, hadn't made noise, hadn't caused any trouble. Saturday morning, she'd seen him briefly in the yard. Saturday evening, the lights were on in his room. Sunday morning, there was no sign of him, but she assumed he was sleeping. Sunday evening, she'd tried texting him about late checkout options. No response. Monday morning, when he hadn't checked out by 11, she used the master key to enter the room. She found his suitcase, his wallet with identification and credit cards, his phone charger, his medications, basically everything a traveler would need. But Kirkwood was gone. The windows were locked from the inside. The door had been locked from the inside. He'd simply vanished. The guest house is a small property, essentially a one-bedroom cottage with a living area, kitchen, and bedroom. There was no basement, no attic, no space for someone to hide. It's not physically possible for someone to disappear from a locked room in a small cottage without leaving evidence. I began conducting interviews. I talked to the neighbors. No one had seen Kirkwood leaving or approaching the property. I talked to the other guests who had been staying nearby. No one had noticed anything unusual. I reviewed the security camera footage from the property's exterior cameras. The footage showed Kirkwood arriving Friday evening, brief footage of him in the yard Saturday morning, but nothing between Saturday evening and Monday morning. No footage of him leaving the property. What was strange about the footage, though, was the quality. The video from the first 3 time periods was clear and normal. But the video covering Saturday afternoon, evening, and Sunday showed visual glitches, moments where the footage would stutter, or segments where there seemed to be missing time. A timestamp would jump from 6:34 p.m. to 8:12 p.m. with no footage of the intervening time. Another section would jump from 11:47 a.m. to 4:03 p.m. I pulled the hard drive from the security system and had it analyzed by our digital forensics team. The technician, a man named Roger Chen, called me with his findings. "The drive is corrupted," he said, "but not in any way I've seen before. It's like there are temporal gaps in the data. Files that should be continuous are fragmented across sectors that shouldn't be physically adjacent. It's almost like the camera was recording from multiple points in time simultaneously, and then that data got mixed together on the drive." I didn't understand what he meant, so he tried to explain it differently. Essentially, the video files had timestamps that didn't match their logical placement in the data sequence. Video from 11:47 a.m. was stored next to video from 4:03 p.m., with no files in between, as if the intermediate hour and 16 minutes of recording had never been created. I brought in the FBI for a consultation. A special agent named Lisa Kowalski came to examine the scene and the evidence. She looked at the room, the video, the timeline, and concluded that Thomas Kirkwood had either been kidnapped by someone with access to the property, or he had murdered himself and his body had been removed by an accomplice. She recommended we search the property more thoroughly. We brought in a search team and searched the cottage completely. We checked for hidden compartments, false walls, crawl spaces, anything that might conceal a body. We found nothing. And then, just to be thorough, we brought in a cadaver dog to sweep the property. The dog had no reaction to any location. 2 weeks into the investigation, I received a call from Susan Matthews. She said she'd found something in the cottage. She'd been doing cleanup and she'd found a note in the trash can in the bedroom. The note was handwritten and had apparently been missed during the initial search. It was from Thomas Kirkwood. The note read, "I can't leave. I tried on Saturday, but something is wrong with the time here. I left through the door and walked out to the road, but I came back and it was still Saturday afternoon. I've tried multiple times. Every time I reach the edge of the property and try to move beyond it, I reset. I'm on a loop. Sunday, Monday, I've experienced them both many times, but I can't move forward in time. I don't know if anyone will find this. I don't know if I'm still here. I don't know if I've always been here. Time is wrong in this place." And at the bottom of the note, there was something else. A list of dates, and with each date, coordinates. The coordinates corresponded to different locations around the greater Seattle area, different guest houses, hotels, rental properties. 32 different locations. The dates ranged from 1987 to 2021. I began investigating those locations. What I discovered was that in the year preceding Kirkwood's disappearance, there had been 11 other missing persons reports filed at properties similar to the Corvina guest house in the greater Seattle and Puget Sound area. People who checked in, secured the door and windows, and then vanished. In each case, the property had reported glitchy security footage with temporal anomalies. In each case, no trace of the person had ever been found. I expanded my investigation to the historical records going back further, and I found a pattern. Guest houses, hotels, rental cottages that reported missing guests without any apparent means of escape, with video footage that showed temporal distortions. The pattern went back to 1987. 32 incidents, 32 missing people, all in properties in the Pacific Northwest region. The properties seemed to be connected by something I couldn't identify. Not a specific owner or management company, not a particular geographic zone, not similar construction or architectural styles. But they all shared one quality. They were all spaces where someone could be completely alone and contained. And in each one, when someone entered and tried to exist in that space for an extended period, time began to malfunction. My supervisors told me to close the Kirkwood case as a cold case missing person. They didn't want me pursuing a theory that involved temporal anomalies in haunted guest houses. But I continued investigating on my own time, and I've identified 11 additional locations that match the pattern. I've contacted the property owners and I've attempted to warn them. Most don't take me seriously, but 2 property owners have reported that after I warned them, guests have stopped disappearing from their properties. It's as if the warning itself, the acknowledgement of what was happening, broke whatever mechanism was causing the temporal distortion. I don't have an explanation for why that would be the case. What I do know is that Thomas Kirkwood is still missing, and I believe he's still existing in that cottage on a recursive time loop, unable to move forward, unable to escape. And I know that there are other properties out there where the same thing is happening. Spaces where time works differently, where guests check in and don't check out, where the video footage of their disappearance reveals gaps of impossible duration. And I know that if I ever enter one of those spaces, I might not leave it. I might end up like Kirkwood, stuck in a Saturday afternoon that I keep trying to escape, never quite reaching the moment of Monday morning when I could leave the property behind. My name is Patricia Valdez, and I'm a search and rescue coordinator in Central Oregon. I've been coordinating rescue operations in the Cascade and High Desert regions for 17 years. In that time, I've handled hundreds of cases: lost hikers, injured climbers, missing persons. Most cases have positive outcomes. We find the person, provide medical assistance if needed, and complete the recovery. But there are cases that haunt me, and the case of the Weeping Ridge in September of 2022 is the most disturbing of them all. On September 8, 2022, we received a report of a missing hiker in the area around Weeping Ridge, a geographical formation in the Wallowa-Whitman National Forest in northeastern Oregon. The missing person was a woman named Amy Silverwood, age 29, who had been hiking solo. She'd left her car at a trailhead early on September 8th morning, told a friend she'd be back by evening, and didn't return. By the next morning, her friend had contacted the local sheriff's department. I was paged in at around 6 a.m. on September 9th and briefed on the case. Amy Silverwood's vehicle was still in the parking lot, and her personal belongings were in the car, which suggested she hadn't voluntarily abandoned the trail. I organized a search team of 12 volunteers and trained SAR personnel, and we began hiking the trail Amy would have taken. The trail in that region is well marked and relatively safe. winding through ponderosa pine forest, gradually climbing to higher elevation. There are several scenic overlooks along the way, including one that looks down on a valley where Weeping Ridge forms a prominent geological feature. A series of rock formations that genuinely appear to have a natural tear-like shape when viewed from the overlook. We searched for 3 days without finding any trace of Amy. No torn clothing, no emergency signals, no abandoned gear. It was as if she'd simply stepped off the trail and vanished into thin air. On the 3rd day, I decided to organize a larger search, and we brought in additional teams, search dogs, and helicopter support from the Oregon Office of Emergency Management. The expanded search expanded to the entire region around the trail. And on the evening of the 4th day, one of the dog teams reported a finding. They'd traced a scent to a small ravine about 2 miles off the main trail, and at the bottom of the ravine was Amy. She was alive. That was the first surprise. She'd been missing for over 4 days, and despite the temperature dropping significantly at night at that elevation, she was alive and conscious. The second surprise was her condition. She was dehydrated but didn't appear to be injured. She wasn't hysterical or panicked. She was calm, almost serenely calm, and she didn't seem to understand why we were there to rescue her. "I haven't been here long," she said as we were preparing her for evacuation. "I got lost on the trail yesterday. I fell into the ravine. I've been resting here waiting for someone to find me, but I haven't been here long." "Amy, you've been missing for 4 days," I said carefully. She looked confused. "No, that's not right. I left the parking lot this morning. I hiked for a couple hours and then I took a wrong turn. I got confused and I fell into this ravine. It's only been a few hours." Her watch showed the correct date and time. According to the watch, it was September 13th at 6:43 p.m. But according to Amy's perception, she'd only been hiking for a few hours and had only been in the ravine for a couple of hours. We evacuated Amy to a hospital in La Grande for evaluation. The medical team found her physically healthy with no signs of injury or illness. They did find her blood chemistry to be slightly unusual. Elevated mineral content, specifically minerals found in volcanic rock. When we tested samples from the ravine where we found her, we found the same mineral profile in the water and soil. But the strangest finding came when Amy's friend, who had reported her missing, came to the hospital. She brought Amy's personal calendar and journal. According to the calendar, Amy had gone hiking on September 8th. But according to her journal, she'd written entries for September 8th, 9th, 10th, 11th, 12th, 13th, and 14th. The handwriting looked like Amy's handwriting, though some entries seemed more rushed or distressed than others. The entries described Amy's experience on the trail. According to the journal, she'd gotten lost on the first day and fallen into the ravine. She'd written about being confused about time. She'd written about hearing voices that seemed to be calling to her from the rocks themselves. She'd written about seeing people who looked like hikers but who moved in unnatural ways. And in the entry dated September 14th, she'd written, "I think I'm dead. I think I died in the fall and I'm still here, still walking in the ravine, still hearing the voices. I think this is what the ridge was trying to tell me. I think this is what the weeping is for." Amy was released from the hospital after 3 days of observation. The doctors found no explanation for her temporal distortion or for her missing time. She was psychiatrically evaluated and found to be psychologically intact, not delusional. But she remained confused about what had actually happened to her. Subsequent interviews revealed that Amy was not the first person to go missing in that region. In fact, when I researched historical records, I found that the Weeping Ridge area had a history of missing hikers and temporal anomalies going back decades. The earliest documented case in the available records was from 1957, when a hiker reported being lost on the trail for what he described as a few hours. But he'd been missing for 11 days. His journal entries, which he'd been able to describe during interviews, indicated that he'd experienced multiple entries for the same day, as if he was living the same 24-hour period repeatedly. I consulted with a geologist about the mineral composition of the Weeping Ridge area, and he told me something interesting. The ridge is located above a significant deposit of magnetite, magnetic iron oxide. The mineral field in that region is unusually strong, and it creates local anomalies in magnetic navigation and electronic systems, but he couldn't explain how that would cause temporal distortion. I've been to the Weeping Ridge multiple times since the Amy Silverwood incident, and I've observed something that shouldn't be possible. When I look at the ridge itself, sometimes I see a single ridge line. Other times it appears to be multiple ridge lines, layered on top of each other, as if the geological formation is existing in multiple temporal states simultaneously. And when I'm in the ravine where we found Amy, I can hear sounds, voices, footsteps, the rustling of clothing. But I can never quite locate the source of the sounds. What disturbs me most is that I've found evidence that some of the people who've gone missing in the Weeping Ridge area were never found. And yet I've also found entries in local historical records mentioning people of the same names being born in future years after their disappearance. It's as if they're existing outside of normal time flow, aging at a different rate, or living multiple lifespans simultaneously. I've recommended that the Weeping Ridge area be closed to hiking and access, but the Forest Service has declined. They say the area is too valuable recreationally and historically to close based on anecdotal evidence. So I remain a SAR coordinator in that region, and I dread the calls that come in about missing hikers. Because now I know that some people who go missing in that region aren't lost. They're stuck, caught between moments, unable to move forward through time, existing in the weeping rocks of a ridge that seems to exist in multiple temporal states simultaneously. And I wonder sometimes if Amy Silverwood's journal entry was correct. I wonder if she did die in that fall, and if she's still walking in the ravine, still hearing the voices, still writing entries in her journal about being confused about time. And I wonder if there are others down there from 1957 and 1972 and 1995 and 2022, all experiencing the same moment over and over, caught in the geological embrace of a ridge that was named for weeping and perhaps named prophetically. My name is Robert Chen, and I own a diner called The Travelers on Highway 101, about 30 miles south of Arcata, California, in an unincorporated area that's technically in Humboldt County but feels like it's part of the greater Pacific Northwest landscape. I've owned this diner for 12 years, and until 3 years ago it was a straightforward business. Good food, reasonable prices, a place where locals and highway travelers could grab a meal at any time. The Travelers is open 24 hours. That's always been the business model. There's a significant truck traffic flow on Highway 101, and there are very few 24-hour establishments in this region. So the business model has always been to cater to that late-night traffic. In November of 2021, I began noticing something unusual about the late-night customers. They weren't like the normal midnight crowd. The truckers and insomniacs and traveling salesmen I was used to serving had a certain quality. They existed coherently in the world. They looked at menus, they talked about family and work, they complained about the coffee and praised the pie. The new customers were different. They started appearing around midnight, always ordering the same meal, eggs and toast and a glass of water. They were always dressed in clothes that looked several decades out of date, clothes that might have been fashionable in the 1970s or 1980s. And they never made eye contact with me or the other waitresses. They would eat in complete silence, looking straight ahead at the wall, and then leave without speaking. I asked my head waitress, a woman named Denise who's worked with me for 8 years, if she'd noticed anything unusual. She confirmed my observations and added something else. The customers all paid in cash, and they all left exact change with no tip. And every single cash payment she'd received from these customers consisted of bills that predated 2000. She still had some of them. A $5 bill from 1987, a 10 from 1993, a 20 from 1998. I started tracking these late-night customers. I kept records of when they appeared, what they ordered, what they paid with, and any distinguishing characteristics. Over the course of 3 months, I documented 32 different customers matching the pattern. Each one appeared only once. Each one ordered the same meal. Each one paid with cash from before 2000. One of my customers, a trucker named Frank Sullivan who frequently stops in around 2 a.m., asked me about the regulars. "You getting a lot of strange folks late at night?" he asked. "I've seen several people walking along the highway near here, always around midnight, always moving in the same direction, always looking like they're from another era. Thought maybe they were a theme group or something, but they never interact with each other, just keep walking." I decided to conduct an experiment. I asked Denise to approach one of the strange customers and ask him a simple question. "Where are you headed?" she asked a man who was eating his eggs and toast with mechanical precision. The man looked at her for the first time, and Denise later described his eyes as being empty, not absent of emotion, but absent of presence. Like looking at a photograph of eyes rather than into actual living eyes. "I'm trying to reach Portland," the man said in a flat voice. "But something is wrong with the highway. I keep driving, but I never get closer. I've been trying for a very long time. So now I just walk. I stop here for a meal and then I walk some more. I don't think I'm going to reach Portland." Denise asked him when he'd started trying to reach Portland. The man thought about this for a long moment. "I don't remember," he said finally. "It was a long time ago. Or maybe it was recently. Time is different on this road." I contacted the California Highway Patrol and reported what I'd been observing. The officer I spoke with, a woman named Patricia Soto, thought I was describing homeless individuals or transients. But when I showed her my records and the pre-2000 currency I'd collected, she became more interested. "I'll investigate," she said. "But I have to tell you, we've been hearing similar reports from other businesses along this highway. People appearing late at night, ordering one meal, paying with old cash, and leaving. No one has been able to identify them or determine where they're coming from. It's not just your diner." Officer Soto and I decided to conduct an observation. On a particular Friday night, she parked her patrol car near my diner in plain clothes. We watched as customers came and went. Around midnight, one of the strange customers appeared. Officer Soto followed him after he left the diner. She radioed me. "Subject is walking north on Highway 101. No vehicle apparent, no luggage or gear, just walking north into the darkness." She followed him in her car at a distance for about 5 miles, and then she lost him. She said the subject simply vanished from the roadside. She pulled over and searched the area with her flashlight, checking both sides of the highway, looking for any place someone might have gone. There was nowhere. The highway was elevated above the surrounding forest, and there were no accessible trails or locations where someone could have disappeared. When she returned to the diner, she was shaken. "I've never experienced anything like that," she said. "That person walked north for 5 miles and then he ceased to exist. There's no explanation for it." I increased security at the diner. I installed additional cameras, I increased staffing, and I kept detailed records of every strange customer. What I began to notice was that the customers seemed to be becoming more distressed. Early customers had been passive and distant. Later customers showed signs of agitation and confusion. And the last customer I served before changing my policy was a woman who looked directly at me and asked, How many times have I eaten this meal? How many times have I tried to reach Portland? How many of me are there existing on this highway at different points in time? I made the decision to close the diner to late-night service. I changed the hours to 5 a.m. to midnight, which meant losing the lucrative late-night trucker traffic, but also meant refusing service to the strange customers. The change was devastating to my business financially, and I nearly closed the diner completely. But something about continuing to serve as a location where these people stopped felt wrong, felt like I was facilitating something I didn't understand. After I changed the hours, I had a visit from Officer Soto. She told me that other businesses along Highway 101 had made similar changes. Closing late-night service, reducing hours, refusing service to late-night customers. And in the locations where the businesses had closed to late-night service, she said, the strange customers had stopped appearing. It's like they were using those locations as anchor points, she theorized. Like they needed the establishment to exist in a certain form, 24-hour, predictable, recurring, in order to manifest at specific times. When the businesses changed their hours, the manifestations stopped. I never returned to 24-hour service. I keep the diner closed at midnight, and I never serve customers who pay with pre-2000 currency and order eggs and toast and a glass of water in complete silence. But I know they're still out there walking Highway 101 trying to reach Portland, existing in a temporal state that allows them to walk a road forever without getting closer to their destination. And sometimes at 11:45 p.m., just before I close the diner, I see people walking north on the highway, always moving in the same direction, never looking left or right. I see their clothes from decades past, their empty eyes, their slow mechanical movement, and I lock the diner door, turn off the lights, and drive home. Because I understand now that some places become infected with temporal disease, and some roads trap people in recursive journeys that have no end. And some business owners have an obligation to stop facilitating the suffering of the trapped, even if it means losing their livelihood in the process. My name is Raymond Torres, and I'm a real estate appraiser specializing in property valuation and dispute resolution in the greater Seattle metropolitan area. I've been working in real estate assessment for 19 years, and I've handled thousands of properties from modest residential homes to high-value commercial properties. My job is to provide objective, documented assessments of property value based on comparable sales, property condition, and market conditions. In January of 2023, I was asked to assess a property dispute. A homeowner was disputing his property tax assessment and claimed that he'd been assessed for more land than he actually owned. I was hired to conduct an independent appraisal and provide a report on the actual dimensions and value of the property. The property was located in an unincorporated area southeast of Seattle, and according to the county records, it was a 5-acre residential parcel with a single-family dwelling built in 1987. The homeowner, a man named Michael Torres, claimed that his property was actually only 3 acres and that the county had made an error in the original survey. I drove out to conduct the appraisal on a cold January morning. The property was accessed via a private driveway about a quarter-mile from the main road. As I drove up the driveway, I could see the house, a modest 2-story structure with significant wear and age, set back among large coniferous trees. I parked and began my assessment. I used a GPS unit, a laser measuring device, and traditional surveying equipment. I walked the perimeter of the property, marking boundary points, taking measurements, and documenting the terrain. I spent about 6 hours on the initial walkthrough. What I discovered was something I'd never encountered in my 19 years of appraising properties. The measurements didn't add up. According to my GPS unit and laser measurements, the property was approximately 3.2 acres, but according to the county records, the property was 5 acres. and according to satellite imagery, the property appeared to be closer to 8 acres. I rechecked my measurements 3 times. I verified my GPS unit's calibration. I even borrowed a second surveying device from a colleague to cross-check my findings. Every measurement confirmed that the actual land area was smaller than either the county records or the satellite imagery indicated. Puzzled, I contacted the county assessor's office and asked if they could provide the original survey documentation. The original survey, conducted in 1989, showed the property as 5 acres, but the surveyor, a man named Howard Kirkland, had noted in his report that the measurements had been difficult to determine due to spatial inconsistencies in the property's boundaries. The surveyor had written that the perimeter seemed to change depending on the time of day and the specific instruments used for measurement. I decided to conduct a more thorough investigation. I began making measurements at different times of day, and I discovered something astonishing. The property size actually changed based on the time I was measuring it. When I measured in the morning between 8 a.m. and 10 a.m., the property was approximately 3.2 acres. When I measured in the afternoon between 1 p.m. and 3 p.m., the property was approximately 5.1 acres. When I measured in the evening between 5 p.m. and 7 p.m., the property was approximately 7.8 acres. And when I measured at night between 9 p.m. and 11 p.m., the property was approximately 12 acres. The property's boundary was literally expanding and contracting based on the time of day. The GPS unit showed consistent results for any specific time window, and the satellite imagery appeared to be capturing the property at roughly 3 p.m., which would explain why it appeared to be around 8 acres. Which was larger than my midday measurement but consistent with the general expansion pattern. I documented this phenomenon extensively and prepared a report for the homeowner and the county assessor. The report was met with skepticism. The county assessor's office suggested that my GPS unit was malfunctioning and that my measurements were inaccurate. They declined to revise the property assessment based on my findings. But I was intrigued, and I wasn't satisfied with the explanation. I contacted the homeowner, Michael Torres, and asked if I could conduct additional research. He agreed, and he also shared something interesting. He'd purchased the property 10 years earlier, and every few years he'd received a revised property tax bill due to boundary surveys conducted by the county. Each revision had increased the assessed acreage. He'd never understood why. I began researching the property's history. I pulled together all available documentation, original deeds, historical surveys, tax assessments, previous appraisals. What I found was a pattern of increasing acreage over time. The property had been listed as 2.5 acres when it was originally developed in the 1980s. By 1989, it was 5 acres. By 2000, it was 6 acres. By 2015, it was 7 acres. By the time I conducted my appraisal in 2023, it was officially listed as 5 acres in the active records, but the historical assessment suggested it had been expanding. I consulted with a physicist I knew, a friend from high school who'd gone into academic research. I explained the phenomenon without initially providing location or other identifying details. His response was that what I was describing was theoretically impossible under normal physical conditions, but that it sounded similar to certain theoretical models of localized space-time distortion that had been proposed but never observed in practice. If a property exists in a location where space-time is behaving non-uniformly, he said, then the physical dimensions of that property could theoretically vary depending on the observer's frame of reference and the time of observation. But we've never documented such a phenomenon occurring in nature. I began investigating whether there was anything unusual about the location itself. I checked geological records, looking for signs of unusual mineral deposits or seismic activity. I checked historical records for any unusual events associated with the land. What I found was a single notation in an old county historical document from 1905, referencing a conflict between a Native American community and European settlers over land claims in the region. The document mentioned disputed boundaries and conflicting understandings of spatial extent. It provided no further details. I eventually completed a revised appraisal report for the homeowner, noting the temporal variation in the property measurements and recommending that the county conduct an independent survey to verify the findings. The county has never acted on this recommendation. Michael Torres still lives on the property. He's told me that he's noticed the changes himself. He says that the distance from his house to his property line varies depending on the time of day. He says he's watched the visible boundary of his land contract in the morning and expand in the evening. And he told me something that disturbed me deeply. He said that sometimes in the evening when the property is at its maximum extension, he sees people walking on his land who shouldn't be there, people walking through areas that during the day would be well outside his property boundary. I think they exist in the evening version of the property, he told me. People or things that manifest in the larger boundary. They're not there during the day because the land boundary contracts and they cease to be present. But in the evening they appear again, existing in the space that only exists at certain times of day. I no longer conduct appraisals for properties in that area of King County. I've referred other appraisers away from it, and I've come to accept that there are places where conventional rules about space and property boundaries simply don't apply. There are locations where the physical world behaves in ways that contradict everything we understand about geometry and dimension. And there are people, or things, that exist in those spaces, manifesting and disappearing based on the time of day, living in a property that literally changes size depending on when you measure it. I wonder sometimes if Michael Torres is still living in his house, or if he's gradually become part of the temporal property himself, existing in the evening version where the boundaries expand, present in the daylight when the property contracts to 3.2 acres, but perhaps trapped in an intermediate state where he can never fully leave the land. My name is Dr. Catherine Morrison, and I'm a research biologist specializing in ecosystem dynamics in the Pacific Northwest. I've been conducting fieldwork in wilderness regions of Oregon and Washington for 12 years, and I've published extensively on the impacts of climate change and environmental degradation on native species populations. In the spring of 2022, I was granted permission to establish a temporary research station in a remote area of the Cascade Mountains in Oregon. The location was selected specifically because it was home to a population of northern spotted owls, an endangered species that I'd been studying for several years. The research station was located about 20 miles from the nearest road, accessible only by hiking trail, and required that I camp in a remote field location for 6 weeks. I brought supplies for the extended stay, camping equipment, research instruments, food, water purification system, and solar charging equipment for my laptop and satellite communication device. The research station consisted of a tent, a food storage area, and a small laboratory area where I could process biological samples, feathers, fecal samples, tissue samples from deceased animals. The first week of research was productive. I was able to locate and observe 3 nesting pairs of spotted owls, collect samples, and begin the preliminary data analysis. The location was beautiful. Old-growth forest, pristine water source, minimal human disturbance. I felt isolated but peaceful. The second week, I began noticing something odd about the research area. Trees that I'd marked with flagging tape seemed to have moved. I'd been carefully mapping the territory using GPS coordinates, but when I returned to specific marked locations, the coordinates would be the same, but the marked trees would be different. Or more strangely, the coordinates would be the same, but the actual location, relative to my camp and the surrounding landscape, would be in a slightly different place. I chalked this up to my own confusion or imprecise GPS work, but I began recording more detailed landmarks in addition to GPS coordinates. I took photographs of specific trees, specific rock formations, and specific trail markers from multiple angles. I created a detailed mental map of the research area. By the third week, the dissonance between my mental map and the physical landscape had become impossible to ignore. A particular stream that I used to collect water samples should have been flowing north into a valley. But the stream was flowing south. The rock formation that should have been east of my camp was now west. The trail that led back to the main hiking trail seemed to go in a different direction each time I followed it, though according to my compass and GPS, the direction remained consistent. I contacted my research station supervisor via satellite communication and reported the anomalies. Dr. James Richardson, my supervisor, suggested that I might be experiencing altitude disorientation, or that my instruments might be malfunctioning. He recommended that I replace the GPS unit's batteries and take more careful notes on compass bearings. I did both of these things, but the anomalies persisted, and something new began happening. I started finding areas of the forest that I was certain I'd been before, but that I didn't remember exploring. I'd be walking in what I believed was familiar territory, and I'd come across a stand of trees that seemed impossibly old, ancient Douglas firs that must have been over 500 years old, but that I had no memory of seeing during my previous weeks of research. I began recording these discoveries with photographs and GPS coordinates, and when I reviewed the photographs later, I noticed something disturbing. In the background of the photographs, there appeared to be structures, crude buildings made of stone and wood, that I didn't remember seeing when I was actually at those locations. The photographs showed architectural forms that seemed to be from multiple historical periods simultaneously, some that looked like they could be centuries old and others that looked more recent. I zoomed in on the photographs and examined them closely. The structures appeared to be dwellings or storage facilities of some kind, and in several of the photographs there appeared to be figures standing near or inside the structures. The figures were too distant and blurred to make out details, but they were definitely humanoid forms. I decided to return to the locations where I'd taken the photographs and conduct a direct observation. I hiked to the first location, a clearing with a particular configuration of ancient trees that I could identify from the photograph. When I arrived at the location, I checked the GPS coordinates. They matched exactly. The trees were in the same position, but there were no structures, no buildings, no figures, just the forest as it should be. But my temperature monitoring equipment, which I used to track ambient conditions for the research, showed something odd. The sensor showed a temperature of 67 degrees Fahrenheit, which was consistent with the cool morning mountain air. But the sensor also showed that the location had registered a temperature of 48 degrees just 5 minutes before I arrived. The temperature change was too rapid to be explained by normal weather patterns. I continued this investigation for the remainder of my stay at the research station. By the time I was ready to leave, I'd collected dozens of photographs showing structures and figures that didn't exist when I returned to the same locations. My instruments were showing temporal fluctuations and spatial inconsistencies that I couldn't explain, and my detailed research notes, which had been carefully organized, had become incoherent, with observations describing forest features that contradicted each other or described the same location as appearing in multiple different states. Dr. Richardson requested that I submit all research data and photographs for review. When he examined the materials, he was concerned not about the mysterious structures or temporal anomalies, but about my mental state. He called me and expressed worry about my psychological condition. "Catherine, these observations don't make sense," he said carefully. "You're describing impossibilities. temporal fluctuations, spatial dislocations, structures that appear and disappear. Either your instruments are profoundly malfunctioning, or you're experiencing a psychological episode brought on by the isolation and stress of extended field research. I tried to explain what I'd experienced, but I knew how it sounded. I agreed to undergo psychological evaluation when I returned from the field. The evaluation found no signs of psychosis or mental illness. I was deemed psychologically fit and cleared to continue my research. But I requested reassignment to a different research site. I couldn't return to the Cascade Mountains location. I couldn't explain why exactly, but the thought of returning to that forest filled me with a specific kind of dread. The sense that I would return and find that more time had passed than I anticipated, or that the forest had changed in fundamental ways, or that I would discover evidence of my own previous expeditions but with no memory of conducting them. I was reassigned to a research site in the Oregon Coast Range, closer to civilization and more easily accessible. But I've continued to receive communications from the Cascade Mountains research area. Hikers and researchers who pass through report finding evidence of habitation, old campsites, structures, artifacts that don't appear on any official maps. Some hikers report becoming disoriented in the area, experiencing time distortion similar to what I experienced. A few have gone missing. 2 years after my departure, I received a communication from a researcher named David Patterson who was conducting wildlife research in the Cascade area. He wrote to tell me that he'd found photographic evidence of an extended structure, what appeared to be an ancient settlement, in a remote section of forest about 2 miles from my former research station location. The structures appeared to be several centuries old, possibly predating European contact with the region. He wanted to investigate further but was having difficulty locating the structures again. Each time he returned to the GPS coordinates, the landscape seemed to have changed, and the structures weren't visible. I haven't responded to his inquiry, and I haven't returned to the Cascade Mountains. But I understand now that there are places where the normal rules of space and time simply don't apply. There are forests where locations exist in multiple states simultaneously, where structures appear and disappear based on some principle I don't understand, where human habitation from different historical periods might coexist in the same physical space, separated not by geography but by something more fundamental, something about the nature of time and dimension itself. And I believe that what I was observing in those photographs wasn't just evidence of multiple historical periods, but evidence of multiple temporal states occupying the same geographic location. I believe there are people, or the remnants of people, existing in those multiple states, present in the forest but invisible when viewed from the wrong temporal perspective. My name is Trevor Washington, and I'm a bus driver for Northwestern Trailways, operating routes throughout the Pacific Northwest. I've been driving interstate routes for 15 years, and I've logged over 750,000 miles on the highways between Seattle, Portland, Eugene, and Boise. I consider myself experienced with the mechanical aspects of driving long hours and familiar with the social dynamics of the late-night bus passenger. In February of 2023, I was operating a night route from Seattle to Portland, a 170-mile journey that typically takes about 3.5 hours with minimal traffic and stops. The route departs Seattle at 10 p.m. and arrives in Portland at approximately 1:30 a.m. The night route typically carries between 8 and 20 passengers, depending on the day of the week. On the particular night in question, February 14th, I had 11 passengers. Most of them boarded in Seattle. 3 additional passengers boarded at an intermediate stop in Salem. The passengers seemed normal, a mix of students, business travelers, and people who appeared to be relocating or traveling for personal reasons. No one seemed particularly memorable. About 45 minutes into the journey, somewhere around milepost 35 on I-5 heading south, I noticed a passenger sitting in the back of the bus who I didn't remember boarding. He was a man, maybe in his 60s, wearing clothes that looked like they'd been purchased sometime in the 1990s. He was sitting alone in a window seat, looking out at the highway. I kept an eye on him through the rearview mirror. It was unusual for someone to board without me noticing, but it wasn't impossible. Perhaps I'd been distracted during boarding in Seattle, or perhaps he'd boarded at the Salem stop when I was conducting a brief vehicle inspection. About an hour into the journey, the passenger pushed the call button to signal me. I pulled over at a safe location and asked what he needed. "Where are we headed?" he asked. "Portland," I told him. "We'll be arriving at the downtown terminal at approximately 1:30 a.m. Is there a problem?" "No problem," he said. "I just wanted to confirm I'm trying to reach Portland. I've been trying for a long time. The journey always seems to take a different amount of time, and I'm never sure if I'm making progress." This seemed like an odd statement, but not necessarily alarming. "How long have you been traveling?" I asked. "I don't remember," he said. "I remember boarding a bus in Seattle, but I don't remember when that was. It feels recent, but it also feels like a very long time ago." "Do you have a ticket?" I asked, which was more of a confirmation since he must have paid for a ticket in order to board. The passenger looked confused. "I think so. I remember giving money to the person taking fares, but I'm not sure what currency I gave. I'm not sure what year it is now." This was starting to sound like someone who might be experiencing a mental health issue, or possibly someone who was intoxicated. I asked if he was feeling okay, if he needed medical attention, if he had someone I could contact. He assured me he was fine, just confused about time. I continued driving. After another 30 minutes or so, I glanced in the rearview mirror and noticed something odd. The passenger was no longer in the back seat. I immediately pulled over and got up to check on him. The back of the bus was empty. No passenger, no belongings, nothing. I checked the bathroom. Empty. I checked every seat. The passenger was simply gone. My next instinct was to count the remaining passengers. I'd started with 11, plus the mystery passenger in the back made 12. Now I was counting 11. The passenger had vanished from a locked vehicle traveling at interstate speed on the highway. I informed the remaining passengers about what had happened and radioed dispatch in Portland to report the situation. Dispatch recommended I pull off at the next rest area and conduct a more thorough vehicle inspection. I did this at a rest stop near milepost 60. I walked through the entire bus, front to back, checking under seats, checking the storage areas below, checking everywhere a person could possibly be hiding. The bus was completely empty except for the other 11 passengers. The additional mystery passenger was gone. No one could explain where he'd come from or where he'd gone. I contacted the state police and reported the incident. An officer responded to the rest area and interviewed me and the passengers. None of the other passengers reported seeing the mystery passenger or could provide any information about him. His name wasn't on any passenger roster. I'd checked my records from the Seattle stop and confirmed that 11 passengers boarded, not 12. The state police officer suggested I might have miscounted passengers or been confused about whether someone had actually boarded, but I was certain about what I'd experienced. I'd seen the man, heard him speak, observed him in the mirror for an extended period of time. I finished the route to Portland, arriving at approximately 1:45 a.m., 15 minutes later than normal. When I submitted my incident report to Northwestern Trailways, my dispatcher suggested that perhaps the passenger had disembarked during one of my earlier stops without me noticing. But I knew that wasn't possible. I'd conducted full vehicle inspections at every stop and I hadn't seen anyone exit. I continued operating the Seattle-Portland route for another 6 months following the incident, but I became hypervigilant about counting passengers and tracking who boarded and disembarked at each stop. I never encountered the mystery passenger again. But I noticed something else. Occasionally, I would arrive in Portland later than expected, with my drive time being extended by 30 minutes to an hour beyond the normal 3.5-hour journey. And on those occasions when my drive time was extended, I would have a vague sense of missing time. The feeling that I'd driven longer than I could account for, as if portions of the journey had occurred without my full awareness. I consulted with other bus drivers operating the same route and asking if they'd experienced similar anomalies. One driver, a woman named Maria Gutierrez, who'd been driving that route for 18 years, told me something interesting. There are times, she said, when the drive takes longer than it should, and there are passengers who appear and disappear. I've learned not to be concerned about it. I figure it's just the nature of long-distance driving. Sometimes you lose time, sometimes your perception of time gets confused. But I've also heard stories from other drivers about passengers who don't exist, who disappear from locked buses, who seem to be confused about what year it is or how long they've been traveling. I think something is wrong with that route. I think something happens to time on I-5 between Seattle and Portland. I requested a transfer to a different route. I now operate a route between Seattle and Olympia, a much shorter distance and generally a daytime route. I no longer work the midnight bus to Portland, but I think about that passenger sometimes. The man who didn't know what year it was, who seemed confused about time, who disappeared from a locked bus on a highway in the middle of the night. I wonder where he went. I wonder if he ever reached Portland. I wonder if he's still boarding buses on I-5 trying to reach a destination, existing in a state where time doesn't move correctly and every journey takes an indeterminate amount of time. And I wonder if there are other passengers like him, trapped on various routes and roads throughout the Pacific Northwest, caught in vehicles and locations where temporal flow is disrupted, forever traveling without ever truly arriving.